Hello, I'm Bob McHugh, and welcome to a different kind of Fifth Estate. One where we turn the cameras on ourselves. Now that our show's 40 years old, we thought it was time to share a few of our deepest secrets.
In 4 decades, we've seen it all. The ones who tried to stare us down.
Does torture happen in Iran?
I don't have to answer that.
Or scare us off.
Cut it.
Dangerous days.
I said to myself, I'm dead.
Bittersweet victories.
It was a powerful moment.
Scenes that haunt us.
I couldn't stop looking at the photos of it.
And faces we'll never forget.
He is so loving, and he's such a beautiful person, and he's going to be okay.
And now we're inviting you behind the scenes to tell you about some of our adventures and misadventures, to let you in on tough decisions we had to make, and the stories that left deep impressions and more than a few scars, as told to you by the people who make this show.
Was it really?
It's an IED strike. 3 casualties, 1 Alpha, 2 Charlies.
I flew in the Black Hawk choppers because they allowed us to, and to get visuals from the air. And the bad guys would be firing at us. They told me in that chopper, though, you know, if something really bad was to go down, right, pick up the rifle underneath.
If anybody ever presents a hazard to this aircraft or whatnot, you have the right to return fire. So if you shoot from this aircraft with your rifle, I'll never say anything except this is a damn good job. Shoot the rotor blade, we'll explain that shit later, but don't shoot the rotor system. Right.
We dropped into places and picked up guys being carried into the chopper because it was the medevac, right? And they're all busted up. They've just been blown to shit, you know, and you're sitting there filming them come in, and then you fly off with them. Your adrenaline's going, and you're filming it all. It's not till I got back to the base that it just sunk in. I went, holy shit. You know, that was heavy duty. Let's go!
It was the height of the war in Afghanistan. The Fifth Estate was embedded in a military base hospital run by Canadian doctors and nurses.
His pressure's been good. It's been like 109.
You didn't know when things were going to happen. And so like the staff in the hospital, you were constantly on. And so you grabbed sleep when you could. You slept with your boots beside your bed because it was just a helicopter coming in and everybody was going to be scrambling again. By the end of it, we had sort of been dubbed honorary members of the hospital, and we were actually helping in a couple of cases carry the gurneys off the helicopters because, you know, if something happens at 3 in the morning, we were closer to the hospital than a lot of the staff members, and so we were often among the first who got there.
So what happened over there?
We were all bedding down for the night. There's an explosion.
Rocket or?
We think it might have been an RPG.
Can I see it?
Yeah.
Holy, it's a big piece.
Morning again.
The memorable one, and I think anybody who saw the film, you know, the one that you will remember is the little Afghan boy who was brought in very badly injured. I mean, everybody just went to town on this boy and fell in love with this boy. He doesn't have the ability to speak, but he had these huge brown eyes that everybody could, you know, and you could tell how frightened he was.
Were there Taliban in the village? Were people firing from the village to the soldiers?
One of the saddest things, and I'll always remember the day that he was finally treated. He was able to eat again and to swallow, and it was time for him to go. And they drove he and his grandfather out to the gate of the compound, and the last shot was of this little face looking over his grandfather's shoulders. The two of them walked into the distance, and you know, everybody was sort of looking at this thinking, you know, what is that boy's future? What is this country's future?
There have been few places more desperate than Haiti, with decades of riots, revolution, and unrest.
In democracy, the best laid plans of politicians and diplomats and do-gooders often go astray when ordinary people decide to take matters into their own hands.
After a coup in 1993, the country was swarming with heavily armed soldiers and paramilitary known as attachés.
It was a very difficult time, and we were about to do a stand-up actually in front of the American Embassy, where Lyndon was going to do a piece to camera. We were out just framing the shot when this Jeep arrived with these attachés, and it was bristling with guns. And these guys. So they all jumped out, and they're just complete thugs, and they're all on drugs.
I was in the van finishing the stand-up I was going to deliver. Neil was out with the crew, and the door slid open. This guy was standing there with a machine gun, pointed right at my belly.
And they immediately put a gun on all of us. In my case, right on my nose. I remember looking to this guy's eyes, and they were the size of saucers.
He was so stoned that he was frothing. He couldn't even talk. I said to myself, I'm dead. I just sort of slowly put my hands up like that.
Eventually, all we did was tell them to calm down and we'll back off and let everyone go home peacefully, and mercifully we got away from it. It does something to you when you have had a couple of guns put in your face. It does allow you to view life in a different way, to put things in a perspective, and I'm grateful for that. I'd like to have gained that experience without such, putting myself in so much danger. I remember in Haiti, when the gun was on my nose, I remember thinking I have 2 young boys at home who actually had lost their mother to cancer. And I was so angry that I'd placed myself, in this situation.
The danger isn't only in war zones. The risk not always personal, but professional, especially in stories that tackle some of society's most powerful institutions, exposing organized crime and police corruption.
Do you realize how big a problem that is? That nobody on your police force saw this coming.
Taking on multinational corporations that put the bottom line first.
He died for a 57-cent piece that should have been fixed over 10 years ago.
One step back!
And then came the Jian Ghomeshi controversy that led us to investigate our own company, the CBC.
It's not easy to do a story where you're going to be taking on people that you can bump into the hallway any day. But the thing I am most proud about that story is that we, from the very beginning, took the position that we are not going to treat this differently in any way. We are going to assume that this is not our company we're talking about, and we are going to go and just do the same kind of journalism we would do everywhere. And that's what we did.
But few Fifth Estate stories have been more challenging than the one that started with allegations a German businessman had given money from a secret bank account to former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney.
Brian Mulroney wins it.
The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the more the Fifth Estate uncovered about the payments, the more outside pressure there was to back off.
I know the pressures that were put on CBC management. It was enormous pressure. The National Post ran an editorial that said, if the Fifth Estate goes ahead with their show tonight, it will be the last show they ever air. Mr. Mulroney's lawyer sent a letter to every single member of the CBC Board of Directors threatening to sue them individually for what we were about to broadcast.
I have $50 million in lawsuits on one story alone, and the CBC says, keep going, Harvey, keep going.
We weren't that worried. It wasn't like, oh my God, we can't do another story. We knew we were right. We knew those lawsuits were, I want to be able to say I'm suing the CBC lawsuits. It wasn't a concern. We kept working on that story.
Ultimately, our research established there were payments to Brian Mulroney from the German businessman. Mulroney eventually acknowledged he'd received more than $200,000 in cash. He said the money was for legitimate business consulting. But the case triggered a major political scandal.
We were always criticized by the Mulrooney forces, always, and by Mulrooney himself, as being anti-conservative. And you know, nothing could be further from the truth. I think what governs us is the desire to expose injustice, expose abuse of power, but most importantly, find out facts that no one knows, that are in the public interest, and tell the public. And that's what we do, and that's what we think about every day when we come to work.
When we come back, to get the answers you want, you can't always be polite.
I think half the things you say are a bunch of crap. And you're telling me you can't stand criticism?
I can't stand criticism.
See more secrets on the web. Pictures from the field. Producers behind the scenes. That's cbc.ca/Fifth Secrets.
I'm Mark Kelly. Welcome back to Secrets of the Fifth Estate. You know, when I was a rookie reporter in Quebec, people working at the Fifth Estate had a bit of a reputation for being fearless and relentless, making their name, chasing down bad guys, and never giving up until they got the story. It was inspiring to watch. And now that I'm at the Fifth, I've learned the stories behind those stories. Sure, the hosts who came before me had a crusading spirit, but mostly they were just first-class contrarians.
What happened in Geneva that you're so upset about? We tried in good faith. We tried in good faith to get a hold of your people.
Can I give you an example of what they've said to us?
No, I would like not to have this on the air, and I'd like to have you stop your camera right now, please.
What kind of a man are you that you could do it?
To do what?
Kill people.
Rooms at the Vogue were under $3 a night.
It was quite a time.
Well, I think to understand the turbulent early days, you've got to understand what the Fifth Estate was. And it was this incredibly, not only important journalistically, but glamorous television program. It came along just on the heels of Watergate and Woodward and Bernstein and the rise of investigative journalism south of the border.
The whole Montreal Games are a fiasco. It's the workers who are to blame. Are they?
It had Adrienne Clarkson, who was arguably the biggest star in Canadian television. The people behind the scenes were the best and the brightest. It was this shining jewel, and it was very exciting.
The Fifth Estate.
Good evening. I'm Adrienne Clarkson.
One of the most famous early encounters featured Adrienne Clarkson's interview with the notorious Shah of Iran, on the verge of being toppled by an Islamic revolution.
It was thrilling to have a show and be on a show where people were watching and every week would respond to what you were doing. You know, interviewing the Shah of Iran was the kind of thing that we would do, and that was an extraordinary experience.
Everyone is crowded, congested, jostled.
It was a few years before she became Canada's Governor General, but she was already clearly comfortable taking on a head of state.
Does torture happen in Iran?
Well, this is a question that was put to me more than once, and which I don't like at all. Because it's so ridiculous that I don't have to answer that.
Then I pressed him some more, because one of the things you learn as an interviewer is that you can ask the question 3 times, and 9 times out of 10, the third time you will get an answer that is really worth putting on the air. So I then asked him, is there torture in Britain? And then he said,
we don't have to torture people. This is the way that unsophisticated organizations were doing things. We are as sophisticated as you are now.
Sophisticated in methods of interrogation.
Yes.
Bob McEwen joined the Fifth Estate for the show's 6th season, alongside Adrienne Clarkson and Eric Malling.
Adrienne was always the portrait of poise and grace. And Eric underneath that smirk was a guy who just loved to misbehave, whether it was on screen or off.
He'd say things to me like, you got that story because you're a girl and things like that. And I said, well, maybe I have. Did you get that story because you were a boy?
Even the king of Saturday night hockey had to face off against Malling and his pushy questions.
I think half the things you say are a bunch of crap. And you're telling me you can't stand criticism?
I can't stand criticism, but what I do is a lot of...
Somebody who dishes it out like you?
I take it where it comes from people like you. It doesn't bother me, left-wingers.
He even rudely broached the subject of Rita McNeil's weight.
I wouldn't ask you this if you weren't a performer, if you weren't a public person. But why don't you lose some weight?
Single-minded and stubborn, he wasn't easy to get along with, even for his colleagues. Like the time he was assigned the story of David Milgaard, serving life for murder in Saskatchewan. The Fifth Estate team believed Milgaard was innocent, but from the beginning, Malling was determined to go his own way, convinced the cops had it right. A skeptical Malling would interview Milgaard, but this interview was never shown on the Fifth Estate.
I don't believe most cops want to see an innocent person sentenced to life. Do you?
I don't think any person would want to see an innocent person sentenced to life, and that's why I'm here today.
He preferred to take the police version, that the guy was as a criminal. And, well, we had a stand-up fight about it, and in the end, Malling persuaded his superiors that he was not going to accept this story. And he would not do it, and he would quit the show first, I think. He even hired his own lawyers. So it was... About that time, I gave up on the story and joined another show.
After Malling left the program, the Fifth Estate kept digging and helped prove Milgaard was in fact wrongfully convicted.
I am an innocent man, right? They have to come and say, we made a mistake, our department's made a mistake, and that's what I want to see done.
Well, sir, could we simply ask you?
But Malling's determination would continue to set the tone at the show he personified.
When they saw the camera, one of them came out and attacked it.
Eric was a contrarian through and through, 24/7, 365. And that's really necessary in what we do in our kind of journalism. You can't just occasionally doubt conventional wisdom or occasionally challenge it. You've got to be bloody-minded enough to be in it for the long haul.
The Fifth Estate prides itself on sticking with stories when many others have moved on. One story would play out over a decade. The murder of a beautiful 22-year-old Canadian named Jassy Sidhu.
The Jassy Sidhu story was a heartbreaking story of a young girl who fell in love with a young man in India against her family's approval. What could be more heartbreaking than falling in love with someone and then to be murdered because of it?
It happened on June 8, 2000, when Jassy and her husband were attacked on a lonely road in northern India. She was found dead the next day. The Indian authorities charged the mother and uncle with murder. But in Canada, the RCMP took a hands-off approach.
We have no jurisdiction to investigate a murder that happened in India, unless we get a specific request from the Indian police.
Mr. Badesha, can I have a word with you, sir?
But if the Mounties wouldn't act, the Fifth Estate would. We would produce 2 more stories and confront the uncle with questions ourselves.
In May and June, leading up to June 8, 2000, 147 telephone calls between you and those men.
I don't know.
Including 40 between you and the man who is still in jail because he is believed to be the man who actually did the murder, who slit her throat. Can you give us any plausible explanation?
I don't know anything.
12 years after our first story, the RCMP arrested Jassy's uncle and mother. They're awaiting extradition to India to face charges of conspiracy to commit murder.
That is a very rewarding part of all of this, when you can truly say, not only did we tell a great story, but it accomplished something. And when you can get somebody into or out of jail, it seems to me that on a personal basis, that's probably as good as it gets.
But sometimes giving a voice to those who have been silenced means doing battle in court first, and that pursuit can take years. Ashley Smith was defiant, aggressive, and suffering from mental illness, and clearly needed help. Instead, she ended up in a federal prison, locked up in solitary confinement most of the time.
It was the story that got to me the most, that in many ways I still live with, that distressed me in a way that it's hard to describe. It became personal. I became angry.
This is your last chance, Ashley. On your stomach, hands behind your back, or OC spray will be used against you. I'm not doing it. It is a direct order. Do it now.
Instead of treating her, they punished Ashley's behavior with pepper spray and restraints.
Lay down. Stop.
On this day alone, Ashley Smith was pepper sprayed 11 times.
Her suicide in custody led to a Fifth Estate investigation lasting 2 years.
She went in as a 15-year-old child with emotional issues. She was a troubled kid. In 4 years, if you are restrained physically, chemically, against your will, whatever mental issues she had, I was convinced that they drove her to suicide.
Again, inmate Smith is putting a ligature on her neck.
The Fifth Estate learned there were surveillance videos of Ashley's last hours in jail. Corrections Canada tried to keep them secret, but after a 2-year court battle, the CBC was able to obtain the videos, making legal history.
We were all waiting for this video, and I will never, ever, ever forget the day the verdict came down and Danny came into the office and he just looked at me and he went, "Total victory!" And he was so happy. And like, I you know, and still when I see him, I see that light in his eyes. You know, it's like, yes, we did have a big impact on the world.
The impact of that broadcast was immediate. It was quite clear that the public was horrified to see that a 19-year-old girl could kill herself in front of 7 witnesses from Corrections Canada.
Ashley.
Hey. Ashley. Hey. Ashley.
It was a powerful moment because, you know, for a lawyer to see the result, the public discussion, the impact of success made it worth it. And what's come out of that? The coroner's jury had to deal with the impact of that. They made over 100 recommendations for changes. Corrections Canada was instructed to change their practices. And I hope that Ashley's death was not for naught.
Action.
When we come back, how we inject drama into journalism.
That was beautiful. Really nice.
I'm Gillian Findlay. Welcome back to Secrets of the Fifth Estate. At this show, we've all done our share of tough stories, and that has often led to some tough calls. What do we do when there's no pictures to illustrate the story we're trying to tell? And what do we do when no one in authority will come on camera to answer our questions? Over the years, that's led to some classic confrontations in front of the camera and more than a few spirited debates behind the scenes.
Mr. Ford, is there any way we can talk to you? What? Come on, you don't want to look like somebody with a bag on his head. You've got nothing to hide, you tell me?
You're a prick.
Just,
you don't do shit like this.
Just sit down with me and convince Canadian taxpayers that they're not financing this.
Hey, Pablo!
All your adventures. We'd like you, if you have nothing to hide, to explain to us where you got the money to start down here if it wasn't from Canadian taxpayers. Rejection's an awful thing.
In the business, we call it a jump. They look impromptu, but in fact, they're governed by strict CBC rules, a last resort to get accountability.
I'm going to ask you to turn that off.
Mr. James.
Sometimes from an accused villain.
We're very much hoping you'll sit down and talk to us.
Not a chance.
Other times, a politician.
Can you respond?
A pastor.
I didn't have a chance to talk to you.
Or an unscrupulous coach.
I think you know we've been trying to talk to you. The thing about calling it a jump or an ambush, which many do, is it's the wrong tone. I see this really as an opportunity for us to speak to them and for them to speak to us. And I see no reason not to be courteous. I see no reason not to make it conversational.
Mr. McKean, could you just explain to us why so many of the ex-members of your church are suggesting that there was mind control involved?
Fifth Estate was not invited, and actually, as you know, we made very specific requests to do a sit-down interview with him, and they were denied.
Sorry, this is actually private property, and you haven't really been invited here today.
Private
so
property?
I would ask
I thought this was owned by the taxpayer of Ontario.
I've had jumps where I've waited for literally days for people to show up. When you do finally see them arrive, you almost can't believe that that's the guy.
Excuse me, Skyfall? Can I introduce myself? Come on, please, I want to take my card.
No, just appreciate it.
I'd like to talk to you, please.
You know what? He doesn't want to.
You know, please, it's getting near time that you talk to somebody. I hate jumps. And one of the reasons I hate them is because they are essentially intrusive, but you identify yourself right up front. Here's my card, here's why I'm doing it. And I'm doing it because you left me no other choice. More in sorrow than in anger, I am jumping you and ruining your day.
I was wondering if I could talk to you about...
Get the f*** out of here!
Why you feel... Why does she feel that she... Why were you...
The stakes are very high in these jumps because, first of all, if we look too aggressive, then it looks bad on us. If we don't do them, then the public doesn't hear from somebody who we think is accountable for this particular issue. So it's always a very tough balancing act.
Kill the court!
And here's another tough balancing act. When to inject drama into journalism. For much of its life, the Fifth Estate was a news magazine show. In the late 90s, that changed dramatically.
I felt that we could deliver an hour of television that was competitive with what you'd see anywhere else. We had to ante up. And the decision was to go with highly produced stories that were still excellent journalism, but were delivered in a much, much more ambitious package. And the term that I came up with was the journalistic movie of the week.
Dramatizations like these have been the subject of controversy and celebration.
I'm grateful to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation who gave me the opportunity and the money to make this film.
The Fifth Estate's John Zaritsky won an Academy Award for his film Just Another Missing Kid. In it, he reconstructed the tragic road trip of a teenage boy and his family's anxious search to find him.
He said that he would call back the next night at 5 o'clock, and he never called back.
Did your brother have any problems with alcohol or
No.
drugs?
No.
The first dramatization ever seen in a CBC documentary featured the real people reenacting the events as they remembered them.
No, I'm sorry, we don't have any medical record of them.
And it caused great consternation.
Set off enormous internal debate. Should we be doing recreations? Because it was so new and so different at that time.
They delayed broadcast of the film for a number of weeks while everybody wrestled with this question of recreations. Sounds kind of funny these days, I mean, doesn't it? I mean, but that's how big a thing it was considered at the time.
30 years later, there's greater gloss on the dramatizations, but old questions remain. How do you know this happened? And happened like this?
The fact of recreations, dramatizations at the Fifth Estate is that we feel they have to have very rigorous rules. They have to be based on the best knowledge we possibly can have, so it's not just out of someone's imagination.
The interior of the house is in darkness, but the SEALs have night vision goggles.
The real-life hunt for Osama bin Laden was played out in total secrecy. And so, with no pictures of the events, we had to create them ourselves.
I don't think I've ever worked on a story that had a more substantial body of information on which it was built than the hunt for bin Laden. What the Navy SEAL Team 6 did, how they did it, what they were thinking at certain points. We had the founder of SEAL Team 6. We had people who had been there and done that telling us what was going on and how it would have felt and looked.
That information was brought to bear here, a location in downtown Toronto, transformed in a day into bin Laden's compound.
The compound was difficult. There's very little information coming out. We didn't know how many people were there. We didn't know how many wives there were, how many children, whatnot. We found his family in Qatar from his first wife, and we've tracked down his youngest wife's brother in Yemen. That's how we came up with what would he likely have been wearing and what would he likely have been eating. We just made a case that, listen, there's a shortage of facts out there. The only information we're getting is from the State Department. We want to just get the facts right. Will you help us?
When they confront bin Laden, he's in the far corner. When his 29-year-old wife Amal rushes towards them, a SEAL shoots her in the leg. The first round hits bin Laden over his left eye. The second in the chest.
In another Fifth Estate documentary, a dramatization built on fine detail exposed the flaws in Canada's most notorious wrongful conviction.
Two children set out on a bike ride that would carry them into Canadian legal history. The girl was Lynn Harper, aged 12. The boy was one of her classmates, Stephen Truscott, aged 14.
2 days later, her body would be found in a wooded grove. Stephen Truscott would be convicted of murder.
In the Truscott case, we were making very specific points about what could and could not happen. So, of course, while we labeled it a recreation, we were very exact in what was happening because that was important to the case.
Gordon Logan, who was 12, was fishing in the river. He told police he looked up and saw Stephen and Lynn drive by.
It was an extremely difficult investigative project, but a key part of the story was what took place from the school down this little country road across a bridge to the highway.
Remember the geography. If Stephen and Lynn crossed the bridge, he could not have killed her in the bush. And two witnesses insisted they saw them cross the bridge, riding double on his bike.
Another key scene was Stephen said from the bridge he could see the car that he said took Lynn Harper away. So we had to make sure the car backed up the way the court testimony said it happened back in the 1950s. That documentary had a huge impact. We uncovered lots of evidence that was hidden from the jurors. We uncovered a new suspect. And finally, 10 years after I first met Stephen Truscott, the Court of Appeal quashed his original verdict from 1959, ruled it was a horrible miscarriage of justice. So it's by far one of the most satisfying stories we've ever done on the Fifth Estate.
When we come back, the faces we can't forget.
This mountain of rubble is a monument to the 1,100 lives lost here last April, when this garment factory collapsed in Bangladesh, unleashing the stories that had long been locked inside.
When Rana Plaza fell, I was riveted by the story. So I couldn't stop looking at the photos of it. And it was the photos that really got me, more than any video that I'd seen. There was one in particular. The photograph is of a couple in the rubble. The man has his arms around the woman and his head is sort of leaning towards her chest, and you don't see her head. It's under like a concrete block, and their bodies are covered with dust. And it's you know, even now, it's hard for me to describe and to look at. It captures everything about that story.
What was gnawing at me is that there were people who had given up their lives, people who had died making cheap T-shirts and cheap clothes for Canadians. And there seemed to be something fundamentally wrong with that idea. Why was this happening? This is what we wanted to find out. We wanted to know more about the working conditions inside Rana Plaza. Who better to tell us than the people who worked there? We were intrigued by this girl, who was trapped in the rubble for 3 days, pinned under 2 dead bodies. She lost her mother as well as her leg. Her name is Arudi.
I thought she was the most beautiful young woman. She has a really striking face. She's just gorgeous. And I couldn't imagine what she went through in that building. I want to always mention that she was making clothes for us, for Canadians. I don't want anybody to forget that there's this, you know, this young girl in Bangladesh, and her only hope in life was to make clothes for us, and now she can't.
I'm telling you, I'm fed up with this shit. I can't put up with it no more, neither can your mother.
You're threatening kids to give you all their money.
Why do you push and shove other kids? When the film came out, it just blew people's minds. I mean, and I still get emails about it.
When he was 4, Evan was classified as conduct disordered, a holy terror for his teachers and his parents.
So the premise was we're going to see parents who are anxious about their children. They're going to go to a small course, 6 weeks. We're going to film them in the course, and ideally we're going to film them at home, and they're going to get better, and it's going to be a happy story.
I want this for 1.5.
For almost 3 months, our cameras, activated by motion sensors, recorded some of the most intimate moments of a family conflict, scenes the family hopes will help explain the trouble with Evan.
Nobody had ever made a film like this before, where the subjects put in the tapes. They were under no obligation to give them to us, and no one had captured these unadulterated moments in a household before, where you saw people acting completely naturally and terrifyingly. You better start telling the truth
Right now, right now!
now, because
We already know that you were lying, so you tell me the truth now!
we know exactly everything you did today.
After school. Go take a look in the mirror.
You look guilty like sin. You saw what damage could be done with just verbal abuse.
I'm gonna hit him.
I don't really want to be a grown-up, but when I get to the age 16 or 17, I want to stay that age.
What's so good about being 16, 17?
I can move out, get a job, get my own place.
After the film went out, sadly the kids were taken into care, and Mike and Karen split up. I saw the family 10 years later. Their family were in better shape at the end of the day. Karen had fought mightily to get the children back, and I think was in a much better place psychologically and felt happier. Evan was still troubled, but was trying to make his way. I think if the family had continued, and by their own admission, they were heading to a very dangerous and desperate situation.
As far as I'm concerned right now, you're not my son. You do what you want. Sayonara.
He was only 5 when his parents decided they didn't want him anymore.
I just remember packing my stuff and then being dropped off at this house.
Handed to a complete stranger, arranged on the internet.
We had read an incredible series about this concept of rehoming in the United States, and literally it is about children whose families, for one reason or another, decide they can't deal with them anymore, and because we live in, the digital era, where these things can happen with the click of a mouse, people were posting children on the internet. And our first instinct was, oh my God, how is that possible? This is where, I can see you post a pet, a dog, an old sofa, but a child, really?
We were stunned when we actually found a case, and we found it pretty quickly. It was like, I think in the first week of doing the research that we actually came across the case of Moses.
The first picture I saw of Moses, he was about 4 years old, and I just thought, this kid is adorable. And I just thought, how could that happen? How could this kid end up with a complete stranger?
I think they were school photos, and he was probably 5, 6 years old. And this smiling little boy in this bright red shirt, looking mischievous and fun, and a handful, I can see. But to think that you could put that child on the internet and say, I can't deal with him anymore. Please, somebody, come take him. Unbelievable.
When authorities discovered what had happened, they retrieved Moses, eventually placing him in a new adoptive home, where today he's a thriving 13-year-old.
I was kind of scared a lot of the time. Didn't know what was happening. I was just a young person, so.
What were you scared of?
I was scared of one thing. I was scared I wasn't going to have a family.
The story I've heard is that they posted something on the internet, and they were looking for somebody to take you because they felt they couldn't deal with you anymore. How does that make you feel?
It doesn't make me feel very good. I feel a bit sad.
Considering everything that's happened to him, he is a normal child, which is an amazing thing to say, because he has every right to be angry or to be moody or to lash out, and he's great. He's just a regular 13-year-old.
And some black people.
When we left after our shoot, he came over and he gave me a hug. And I thought the ability for this boy to forgive and to move forward in his life is just amazing. And that's why I will never forget him.
Of course, there are many, many more stories that we couldn't fit into just 1 hour of television. And so we've created a website that contains a lot of extras. Some pretty surprising things that I've never seen before. More adventures from the road, candid interviews, and some pretty wild photos.
And there's something else about that website. You can go there and watch the piece you just saw, but you can stop anywhere you want and get all kinds of extra information and interviews. It is the first time we've made what you might call a truly interactive documentary. And of course, you can watch it all at cbc.ca/5thsecrets.
So that's what we've been up to in our first 40 years, and we're looking forward to the next 40. But before we close tonight, there's another tradition that goes back to the very beginning of the Fifth Estate. It's something we like to call the awkward host goodnight.
That's next week on the Fifth Estate. Please join us. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
That's next week on the Fifth Estate. Please join us. Good night. Good night.
Good night.
So, on that note, good night, Jillian. Good night, Bob.
Nothing awkward about this.
No,
Good night,
not
Mary.
at all.
Jill.
Bob, Mark, good night, all of you.
And thanks for watching.